Now, John Lennon at 80.
To celebrate what would have been John Lennon's 80th birthday, Sean Ono Lennon has been speaking to three of those closest to his father. His brother Julian Lennon, his godfather Elton John, and his dad's former bandmate Paul McCartney. What you're about to hear is Sean's interview with Elton John in full. You can find more programmes by searching BBC Sounds for John Lennon at 80. Now, here's Sean and Elton John.
Well, I always think that you guys seem to actually mature faster than my generation, because I feel like we're all sort of terminally adolescent in a way. And when I look at interviews with my dad when he was 20, he just seems so on top of his game.
Yeah, I think that's because of where we came from. I mean, we grew up in the 50s and 60s, and we listened to a lot of radio, and we did a lot of reading, and you know, we were influenced by a lot of incredible music. And I think we grew up quicker. I think we had to, in a sort of way. We didn't have the distractions of social media and internet and, you know, whatever.
Sure.
And so I think we grew up a little bit more quicker because we did things more. We went out and we socialized more, maybe. I don't know. But I'm very grateful I grew up in that period of time, even though the 50s were pretty horrible because there was such a conservative era where no one talked about sex or anything.
Right. But that sort of led to the explosion of, you know, the Summer of Love and stuff, didn't it?
Yeah, and it all exploded when Elvis happened in 1957, and Jerry Lee Lewis and Little Richard and Fats Domino and all those people, and then it led to, of course, to the incredible 60s and the most incredible creative boom that I can ever remember, both not only in music but film, photography, art, theatre, dance. It just was that time when everything people were willing to collaborate with each other and experiment. I mean, the Beatles, for example, with Ravi Shankar, and you know, there were no barriers to music in those days, and it was.
Yeah, it did seem like there was more intermingling between the musicians and bands. Like the Stones were doing some of my dad and Paul's tunes, and people would record together, like you and my dad. A lot of the mythology of the Beatles and you and that period actually seems so set in stone to me. It's like everyone knows it. But I do feel like there's a young generation, like Generation Z, who, you know, might have heard things, but they don't quite know what happened in those days. And you're a bit younger than Dad, so I was just wondering, like, could you put it a bit in perspective? Like, what were the Beatles like to you? You were a bit younger than them, right? So what did it mean to you? I mean, you'd already been trained at the Royal Academy and all that, but as a musician, like, how did that impact you personally?
Well, I remember the first Beatles record I ever saw was my friend Michael Johnson at school bought Love Me Do in, and he said, this band are going to be the biggest band in the world. I listened to it and I thought it's pretty good, and it dented the chart, and he became their fourth fan club member. And then I think it was just the explosion with the Beatles. It was the first thing that really came out of Britain in as far as pop music goes, that really was kind of, even though they were influenced, and we were all influenced by American artists, it had an original sound. It was, you know, things were written about Liverpool, Strawberry Fields. It felt authentic. And then there was so many bands coming out of Liverpool and from up north. And it was just an explosion of great Britishness, which made us all feel good. And also the songs were so brilliant. If you analyze and look at the Beatles song list, from all their albums, it's just terrifying how good the songs are.
And they were one of the first bands to write for themselves. I mean, it wasn't necessarily assumed in those days that you would even write your own tunes. Is that right?
Yeah, because on their first album, they covered Cookies, Chains. So did the Stones. The Stones' first record was a cover of a Chuck Berry song.
And did you start at Dick James' music publishing place? You were doing covers and writing for other people first as well, right?
Yeah, I was doing cover versions, you know, for cheap cover versions that they sold for, you know, like £1. Albums of covers of Stevie Wonder and the Bee Gees and things like that, and doing backing vocals for. I played on the Hollies, He Ain't Heavy, He's My Brother, and the follow-up, and I did things for the Scaffold, who were a brilliant Liverpool funny group. They were brilliant. So I earned my corn by doing backing vocals and meeting a lot of people back there. I remember the first time I met a Beatle. I didn't actually meet him, but I was on a Baron Knight session. The Baron Knights were a kind of comedy band who had lots of hit records in England. And Paul came into the studio as Abbey Road, the big studio. And it was when Hey Jude was out. And, obviously, Bernie and I were there standing in the back of the studio going, oh my God, it's Paul McCartney. And then Baron Knight made a big fuss of Paul and said, love the record. And then they asked Paul to play it and he played Hey Jude. And it's a moment I'll never forget. The excitement about the Beatles, it was just extraordinary. I remember cycling to get Sergeant Pepper. I had to cycle about 8 miles from my nearest record shop, and it was a gatefold sleeve, so I had to hold it in one hand and cycle with the other because I didn't want it to be damaged. It was the first gatefold sleeve the Beatles had ever made, and it was just, at that time, it was the most incredible. It was just an explosion, as you say, of creativity, both artistically, visually, musically, and everything. And the Beatles were at the heart of all of it.
Because I've read that my dad, when he first heard your voice, he was in America, I think, already, and he was thinking that's the first new kind of British singing that he really liked and dug. I think he said that he loved your music and the songs, and he liked the song, your song, and that he saw a picture of Bowie and hadn't even heard him yet, but just kind of got the vibe and thought he was going to be cool as well. So did you hear about that, and how did that make you feel before you actually met him?
I didn't know about that. I knew I had a telegram from George when my first album, the Elton John album, got in the charts in America, and that was so exciting. I didn't really know that your dad was such a fan till I actually met him in 1973. And I was when I met your dad, I was a little bit, obviously I was in awe. I was in awe of meeting any of the Beatles, and they all treated me so brilliantly. But your dad had that edge that none of the other Beatles had, because he wasn't afraid to say what he thought. And I met him on a video shoot for Mind Games with my friend Tony King playing the Queen.
Oh, right. Tony King was dressed as Queen Elizabeth. Did he dress as Queen Elizabeth before you did?
Yes.
Was he the first? That's funny.
And then I was wearing a bright green Saint Laurent satin suit. And I thought, in for a penny, in for a pound. And your dad was as kind and as generous and sweet. And we just hit it off immediately. He was so funny. That's what I loved about him. And we talked about music, and we talked about records we loved.
And other things. You did other things, I heard.
Yeah, we did other things. We did a lot of naughty things together. We had a lot of fun. Oh, my God.
Did that lead directly to you recording on Walls and Bridges? Because that was 74, but I don't know when the record was actually recorded. But I guess in those days, it was recorded and then put out straight away, wasn't it?
Straight away. I mean, I remember going to the session, and Tony King was working still with your dad then, and John asked me to play and sing on the record. Jimmy Iovine was the engineer, and the track had already been done, so I had to put my piano on, which was easy. But then the thing is, John had already done his lead part. I was very nervous, but it was great fun, and it was a great track. And I said, listen, this is a #1 record. And he went, no, we're not going to put this out as a single first. But I think it was the guy at Capitol, was it Al Curry or someone, who said, yeah, this is the single. And so he went, okay. And I said, listen, if it gets to #1, you've got to come on stage with me. And he never thought in a million years it would get to #1, and it did.
So you had a sense of it when you heard it. You just thought this is a hit.
The energy and everything about it was so joyful, and it was unusual. It was an unusual track for your dad to record, because it was very, very upbeat.
Yeah, it wasn't cynical sort of at all.
No, it was just really happy and great. And, people who played in it were amazing. I mean, Bobby Keys on sax and Jim Keltner on drums. It's unlike anything your dad had ever done.
Well, I actually got to just listen to the multi-tracks of that song because we kind of put out a 80th anniversary compilation, and it was exciting because your piano is so exciting. And I think my dad had said something like it was a shot in the arm or something. So I think he really felt like it gave it the energy that it needed.
Well, to be honest with you, and I don't want to sound corny, but if you're playing on one of your dad's records, you don't need, the energy suddenly is there. If you don't perform, then, you're dead, basically, because it was just, for me, it was a dream come true. Playing on your dad's record and was, for me, I could have died and gone to heaven. I cycled to Hatch to get the Beatles album, and here I am playing on his record and having the greatest time and having the best fun with him. I mean, we got into trouble, or we nearly got into trouble a few times, but we never had a bad word. And he's kind. I always thought John was the one that could, turn, or stuff. People say, oh, watch out for him, he can turn. And I think maybe when he was drinking a lot and everything he did, but I never saw that. And all I saw from your dad, to be honest with you, there was so much, we laughed so much, because we talked about the 50s and 60s and where we grew up, round the horn in England, the radio shows we liked, the songs we liked, who we didn't like. And, your dad was just a fountain of knowledge. It was a hand-in-glove thing, and I never thought that would ever happen.
So did that lead to you recording Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds with him, or did one session kind of follow the next? I know Whatever Gets You Through the Night was New York. Where did you do Lucy?
I did it at Caribou. We were making an album. And at that time, I used to make separate singles like Philadelphia Freedom and things like that. And I said to your dad, I'd love to record one of your songs. I said, what would you like me to do? And he said, you know what? He said, people recorded our songs. There's so many versions of our song. No one's ever done Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. So I said, right, you're on, we'll do it.
I love that version of it. It's very cool. It's kind of got a groove to it that's different.
And he came down and we did One Day at a Time as well, I think.
And how was that? Were you more relaxed by then, or how was my dad? Was he sort of just having fun, or was he nervous?
No, he loved my band. The band loved him. He was just like you. When I met your dad, it's if I felt as if I'd known him all my life. And that's the biggest compliment I can pay him. There was no side to your dad. He wasn't a snob. He wasn't anything. He liked what he liked and he didn't like what he didn't. He was very vocal about it. But, as far as being a person, I just absolutely thought he was just the best. I just got on with him. There was no attitude. I hate posers and I hate attitude, and your dad didn't have any of it.
Well, I imagine he had a special love and respect for you, so he might not have been the same with everyone necessarily, but I mean, because I've been lucky enough to meet people who I really looked up to as well, and it doesn't always click as on a human level. You might still be excited, but it's nice that you guys managed to really be friends. And I know you really were, because my mom always talked about it. And also, obviously, there's this famous story in my origin story that revolves around a famous concert that you did with Dad. And that ties into the bet you had made. So you said, look, if this goes number one, or he said, if it goes number one, I'll play a live show with you, which I think is something he'd been avoiding shows at the time or something, yeah?
He was terrified. I mean, I can absolutely tell you he was terrified. And I can tell you that he was physically sick before the show, absolutely physically sick. We'd rehearsed. He was fine in rehearsal and everything. But I think when he came on stage, he was fine, because the reception that he got at Thanksgiving at Madison Square Garden in 1974 was, I've never heard a noise or roar like it. And it was just, we all get goosebumps thinking about it. And a lot of us cried, and there were tears running down our faces, because here was one of the four people that were the biggest band ever coming out and playing with us. Those things are like, you treasure them. And that night, I think the reception he got, he wasn't nervous during the show. He just played the same brilliantly. But he came on very kind of slunk behind the amp. And then when he heard that roar, I think he thought, God, New York loves me. And boy, did they.
Well, it's amazing, because that show is so legendary for me personally, because I grew up with this photograph of my mom and dad backstage at your show, and they're looking at each other with real love in their eyes. And they had been separated for 18 months, apparently, and I know that's when you guys had been hanging out, you and my dad. But the story is that, my mom hadn't necessarily intended on going to the show. She did with a friend. She told me she sent a white gardenia backstage, which I don't know if that's just myth or legend. And then they met. And then I was born 9 months later, approximately. I mean, almost to the day. So in a way, if it wasn't for you playing that show, I can honestly say I wouldn't even exist, probably.
Well, it was extraordinary, because I think John wore the gardenia on the show. I think he wore it on his suit or his jacket.
Oh, right, yeah. I have seen the pictures.
And then after the show finished and we all sat down, and we went to the Pierre Hotel for a little after show thing. And my manager and myself, John Reed and myself, sat at a table with your mum and your dad. And the astonishing thing was, Sean, that after that, and then you were born, I really didn't hear or see your dad at all. And I didn't mind because, you know what, he was so happy being back with your mum. And he was so enchanted having you that it was his life had become another thing. And so I didn't really speak to him or see him that much at all or hear from him. And I didn't mind because it was just the fact that that night was so consequential in the history of his life, the fact that he got back together with your mum and then they had you, and that consequently, that's why he asked me to be your godfather, because it was happenstance and kismet, you know?
One of the, well, I think maybe the first concert I ever went to was yours actually as well. And I remember it quite well. I was very young. I think I was 5 or 6. It was right after Dad had passed away. And you let my mom and I come up on stage. And it was really incredible because I hadn't even been to a concert, let alone Madison Square Garden with you playing. I remember you wore this giant yellow duck costume, which was just so great for me because it was really like my age group kind of audience. I love cartoons and I just loved it so much. But I never forgot that you had written a song called Empty Garden about Dad. I guess you wrote it with Bernie, I'm not sure. But
I wrote it with Bernie, and it was something that I really, really wanted to do. I mean, I remember when we got the news of your dad's death we were on a plane coming from Brisbane in Australia to Melbourne, and we were told to stay on the plane. And I thought my grandmother had died. Oh, she's quite old. And then when we were told about John, none of us could believe it. And we organised a service at the cathedral in Melbourne at the same time as the service in New York, which was, the time difference is quite shocking between Australia and New York. But we got up and we did it, and we sang hymns and we paid our tributes at the same time as the service was going on in New York, because I was very, very much affected by the death of your father, as everybody was. And we couldn't believe it. Just, there was no health issues. It was just a blatant, awful homicide. About a year afterwards, Bernie said, I'd really like to write a lyric about John if you think that's a good idea. And I said, I would love to. And I loved the lyric and I loved the song. And I played it when I was in Vegas, the $1 Million Piano. And, there was a video with your mum and your dad walking through Central Park. And, I told the story of how much I loved your dad and sang this song because, I've never really sung it. Except in Vegas. It's very hard for me to sing it. I get quite emotional singing that song. It moves me so much because it reminds me of how, God, if your dad was alive today, can you imagine what he'd be doing?
I do. I try to imagine it all the time, to be honest. But I have to say that song really meant a lot to me at the time, and I got to thank you for it because I listened to it a lot, and I think it was really healing for me. Because I was very young, but I knew you were friends. I knew you were my godfather. I knew you were singing about Dad, and it's a real powerful tune. And not everyone remembers it, but I listened to it all the time, and I think it was sort of part of my mourning process. And I got to thank you for that one.
Empty Garden was a heartfelt tribute to someone who, unfortunately, we don't see the like of anymore. Your dad didn't, he didn't stand for any old nonsense. He was a peace-loving, brilliant, funny, opinionated, just a treasure, really. I mean, I don't want to get too maudlin, but we need people like him today, and there aren't that many people. There's nobody around like him.
There aren't, and I do wish he could speak for himself because, I'm constantly barraged with people telling me what they think he would believe about this, that, or the other. And I really, I don't want to pretend that I know exactly what he would think about anything, but I always tell them whatever he would have thought now, I don't know what it would have been, but it wouldn't have been what you'd think he would think, because he always sort of changed his mind. He wasn't stuck. And that's the one thing I find to have been consistent about him, is that he changed and updated his thinking all the time. So I don't know what he would have thought, but it wouldn't have been the same things he thought in 1975 or something, because he would have evolved. I know that much.
I think if your dad had still been alive, he would have definitely been maybe won the Nobel Peace Prize or something. That was what your dad was. He wanted to bring people together, and he was a uniter, and he was prepared to go to any length to make people see what his point was. And a lot of people didn't like it. And a lot of people, like the FBI, and they gave him a hard time, but it didn't deter him whatsoever. But I think when he had you, he mellowed a lot, because I just think he relished spending the time with you that he probably hadn't have done with his first boy, with Julian. And I can see that, and I think it mellowed him a lot by being back with your mum and just having a family life. He was here. He went, but when he was here, he did so much good, and he influenced and inspired so many people, and he loved so many people, and I miss that. There aren't many people around today with that kind of personality or strength of character, and we just wish he was here. And so, obviously, you do. We all do. Yeah. Well, I mean, I know for sure that he loved you equally, because I read a lot about things he said, and he never really spoke of anyone as highly as you. He really did love you, and I'm very appreciative of your relationship with him, because it literally led to my conception and existence. So well, I'm glad it did, and I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad you're flourishing.
You can find more programmes by searching BBC Sounds for John Lennon at 80.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.